speak today. We appreciate it. So we'll just do some introductions first before we get into the presentation. So I'm Gary Mundy, Director of Research and Evaluation with Career Connect, and I'm with my colleague Sarah Vaughan, and I'll let Sarah introduce herself.
Hi, yes, I'm Sarah Vaughan, so I'm the Service Manager for Sefton NEET Contract.
Great. So we'll go straight into it. So this is a piece of work that we did last year around the contract, the NEET prevention contract service that we run in partnership with Sefton Local Authority in Liverpool City region. And say a little bit about the background to it. So what we saw here was an opportunity to look at the impact of an early intervention approach for NEET prevention. We know that early interventions are often highlighted as part of the solution for NEET, but there is actually relatively little evidence about what early interventions look like for this group, particularly in a UK context, and particularly for those groups of young people who are most at risk. So there were a couple of evidence reviews that I refer to here. So there was a Learning Work Institute evidence review in 2020. And then there's the Youth Futures Foundation evidence toolkit as well, both of which are really useful contributions, but relatively little understanding about what early intervention looks like. What's the impact of that, both sort of quantitatively in terms of understanding how it affects measures of NEET, and then also, I think importantly, qualitatively as well. So if you're seeing some sort of impact or change there, understanding how is it working and why is it working? What is it about early interventions that are making a difference? And we had an opportunity through our contract, our work with Sefton Local Authority, to look at this retrospectively. And important to keep in mind that this was retrospective. So it wasn't a study that was designed at the outset, and then we went out and sort of collected data prospectively. It was being opportunistic about a change in the contract, in the model, in the delivery model in 2019, that allowed us to look at that data from 2019 onwards to see what difference that's making. And I'll say a little bit more detail about that at the moment. But because it is retrospective, there are obviously going to be some gaps in the data that's there. There's always things that we wish we'd had that we just don't have. But given that there are these gaps in data and evidence around early interventions, we thought this was something worth looking at and worth sharing more widely. So I'll just say a little bit about and this is a very simplified summary of the Sefton model pre and post 2019. So pre 2019, it was primarily a sort of a reactive service. So it was a service that targeted young people once they became 16, once they'd left school, and if they became NEET, and then trying to support those young people into EET provision. There was some, but very minimal preventative provision for those pre-16 who are still in school, and no preventative provision or very minimal preventative provision for those who are 16 that were in employment, education or training, but perhaps vulnerable to falling out of that. And there was a sort of separation of responsibilities for young people. So pre-16 was very much schools and careers and that sort of support system, and then post-16 onto local authorities and becomes a sort of NEET prevention issue. That is a simplification, but by and large there was that sort of quite clear division between responsibilities. And then switching to post-2019 service, and this is what Sarah will say a lot more about this as we go through this morning, because Sarah actually delivers this, and as opposed to me, I just talk about it, but Sarah has that sort of very operational understanding about how all this works. So that post 2019, that became targeted enhanced provision from year 9 onwards for those identified as being high risk of NEET. Local authorities and schools started working much more closely together along with us, with the service provider, to provide that sort of stable transition and continuity of transition from pre-16 to post-16. The support was then majorly driven by young person's needs rather than thinking what the statutory requirements of provision should be. It was really trying to take that sort of person-centred approach. And then the other change was the ongoing provision post-16 for those young people that had gone into education, further education, employment or training, who were identified by Sarah and team as being at risk of having a vulnerability to becoming NEET in the future, and trying to intervene early there to prevent as part of that sort of package of NEET prevention. So that is a very sort of general summary, high-level summary of the pre-2019 service, and then what that service looked like post-2019, but we'll get into more of that as we go through the morning. And then just an important point to say, those changes were budget neutral. So you're looking at a sort of resource package, which pretty much stayed the same from 2019 onwards. So what we're going to describe here and what some of the results we've seen aren't a result of sort of throwing more money at the issue, is primarily a result of a change in the model of the service and a change in the approach. So I'll just talk a little bit about the data that we used that we're going to present. So what we have as part of the service that we run with Sefton Council, we track all young people that are coming out of school, and as part of that tracking service and reporting back into DFE, the NCCIS data on young people's NEET status and EET status, there's a whole bunch of data that we collect. So what we did was retrospectively, we looked at school leavers from 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. We looked at each of those cohorts, and we looked at their NEET status in the months immediately leaving school. So I think this is October. And then we looked at their NEET status in March of at the end of March of the following year, and we looked at two things. So we just looked at their NEET status in October and then in the following year, and then we also looked at their days spent NEET. So the average days per young person that became NEET, how long they spent NEET, because we thought that was an important metric as well. So yeah, we didn't know back in 2019 that we were going to do this. So I'm sure there's lots of other data, if we had thought about it back in 2019, that we would have collected. But it would just the fact that we had all of that data spanning that time period and spanning that change in service delivery over those 4 years, it seemed a really good opportunity to see what difference it had made. Alongside that, we also did interviews. We did interviews with young people that are using the service as part of our Youth Voice function. We did interviews with the delivery Sarah's team in Sefton to understand how they saw the service as working, particularly trying to understand why they thought it was working or what made it impactful. And then with a range of partners at Sefton Council as well. And again, exploring sort of rationale for the changes that were made in the service, and then how they thought that was working, and what, again, trying to understand what they saw as the drivers of the impact that was being seen. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah now, and I'm going to still sort of try and navigate the slides, Sarah. So if I'm on the wrong slide, just give me the nod, right?
Thanks, Gary. Okay, so this slide shows as Gary's just been saying, in terms of the school leaving cohorts. So you can see from 2019 to 2022, the risk of NEET identified in those set vulnerable groups. And you can see year on year, with the exception of Youth Justice in 2021, the cohorts grew. So our approximate school leaving cohort around 3,000.
Sorry, just before you get into that, just very quickly, you mentioned about James. Has he given any indication yet on timeline for the? I
think that's someone with a hot mic.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. I thought it was a question for me then.
No, I think it was just someone had their mic on. I think they've turned it off now. So you go ahead, okay. Sarah.
Sorry. So yeah. So just in this slide showing the growing increase of school leavers at risk of NEET. So those young people that were targeted in our cohort, and we can see year on year that increased. I think that shows in terms of the needs, but also I think that's around the robust systems and actually how we got better at identifying the needs year on year, and that partnership across. And also I think because we were having impact as well, that helped in terms of that early identification and support within Sefton. Gary, if you want to go on to the next slide. So in terms of the school leavers and the impact, we can see here that in the year, at the October following the school leave, and you can see the improvement in the NEAT. So particularly with the care experience young people, which for our cohort, about 75% of our cared for children are targeted at risk of NEAT. So they're probably a smaller group, but actually have the most complex needs. And we've seen that was our biggest reduction in NEAT. And also you can see our SEND and youth justice there. In terms of not known, and I think it's really important for colleagues to understand the not known status is around the accuracy of the data. And actually, when we do report to DFE, it is a joint combined NEAT and not known, because you can have a high not known, but that doesn't mean that your NEAT, is low, because you need to combine them. So in Sefton, we can validate our data, it's accurate, we can track our young people, they're engaged, and we're targeting. So you can see there in comparison to North Western England, Sefton is 0.1. If you go on to the next slide, I think this is really key in terms of the delivery of the service, where we've seen an increase in the number of interventions. So when Gary was saying before about the numbers of days NEAT, in 2019, our cohort at risk of NEAT, these vulnerable groups were averaging 176 days NEAT, and in 2022 we were showing a reduction to 77 days NEAT, so that's 99 days. And what you can see here, the line from 5 to 12 is that increase in interventions. So what we've seen is where our interventions have increased with this cohort, the number of days and the impact on those number of days spent NEAT has improved. Okay, next slide, Gary. So this is broken down now in terms of the vulnerable group. So the grey shade in the bars is the interventions pre-16 and post-16. So what you can see, and this is where Gary was saying before, where we remodeled the service to actually start earlier in the year 9, 10 and 11 to put those interventions in, so that we can support that transition and actually continue to support post-16. But what we've seen in the research was that actually less interventions were needed post-16 because of the outcomes and impact that you were having pre-16. So you can see that's evident here in terms of and the more interventions year on year we were doing with this group as the processes and partnerships improved. So you can see in 2022 an average of 8 interventions, 8.6 interventions, and that meant less interventions were needed post-16. So you can see that there. And before, when I was saying around the care experienced or care for children, you can see that was, a lot of work is done in the pre-16 in terms of that support and preparation and interventions with that cohort. So you can see the engagement and how we've done more engagements with the pre-16 and less is needed with the post-16. The next slide, Gary. So one of our biggest cohort for our vulnerable groups is our SEND young people. So elected those with education healthcare plans. So you can see, and this was published last summer of 2022, school leavers. So Sefton SEND young people who post-16 transition, 95.6% going into EAT, compared to the England average of 88.6, so a 7% increase on England. Sorry, sort of difference in terms of comparison. But actually this colourful bar chart on the right hand side shows our mainstream. So this is all Sefton's young people is 97.1%. So and if you see England's, or 16 and 17, those it's 94.1. So what this is showing, and what I really wanted to highlight, is that our actual Sefton Send young people are above the England mainstream in terms of EAT outcomes for provision, because you can see by that dark line for England, the average is 94.1, and actually Sefton Send is higher than that, 95.6. So I think that demonstrates in terms of that transition support for our Send cohort. Gary? You're on mute, Gary.
I forgot, of course, that my microphone was muted. Apologies. Yeah, so I mean, so that's the data. So that was a lot of that data. Again, that's data that we collect through the tracking service that we provide. So we've got data on NEET status, their days spent NEET, but then also, as Sarah was talking about there, the number of interventions, the number of contacts that we have with those young people. So it is a really rich data set that not just we hold in Sefton, but also most local, if not all local authorities hold that data. So that potential for doing this analysis elsewhere exists. It'd be really interesting to look at about, you know, if others have looked at this, or if others see the potential for looking this in their areas. So perspectives on why it works. We've got a couple of quotes there from some of the young people that we spoke with as part of this piece of work. But I just want to summarize what we saw as like the 5 sort of components or 5 dimensions that made the difference that we see in the data. So the first thing was the absolute sort of relationships of trust and flexibility between advisors and young people. And again, you're talking about young people here who are sort of most vulnerable to becoming NEET, many of whom are sort of disengaged from other services as well. So building up those relationships of trust takes time. And so doing that earlier, rather than waiting until they're 16, until they are NEET, and then intervening, and you're at that point you're going to be spending most of your time building up that relationship of trust, rather than sort of trying to move them into appropriate education, employment or training provision. So relationships are key, but relationships take time to build up. So that is a sort of key component of why intervening early works. It also, part of that, it allows advisors and young people to understand better about what the aspirations and options are, and builds in that time. So not just building trust, but really building in that understanding of where that young person wants to go, what the options are, and how you can bring those two things together and create a sort of pathway and a plan to get them to walk them through that. Thirdly, and absolutely key, and I'm sure this will come out a bit later when we're talking about some of the details about how this has worked in Sefton, but that close partnership working between schools and local authorities, and in this case the provider, which was us, but whoever that provider of that support service is really, really key. I don't think we would have seen these the kinds of results we've had if you didn't have that close working. Absolutely crucial, I think. And then the fourth component is that continuity of support from pre to post 16. So having the same advisor and the same team of people supporting young people over that period, 3 or 4 years, and even supporting them when they're in provision post 16, and recognizing that vulnerability to becoming NEET continues, for young people that have moved into further education or into employment or into training opportunities that are there, and ensuring that support continues, and identifying when there may be vulnerability to young people coming out of that provision, and trying to intervene early to make sure that they are continuing in a provision that is aligned with their needs and where they want to go. And then I think the last point is the use of data and evidence on risk of NEET to target those interventions. And again, something Sarah can talk a lot more about, but it's very noticeable, I think, that it's, that sort of analytical perspective isn't just when we're doing pieces of research like this, but it's something that Sarah has and her team have throughout service delivery, really using the data to look at who, to target the interventions, but then also to monitor how well they're working. And then just a few points looking forward, and it'd be interesting to have sort of discussion with the wider group here about this. So I think one of the key sort of takeaways for me is that the principles and characteristics of the model that we've seen in Sefton are replicable. They're not unique to anything that, any sort of particular set of circumstances in Sefton. So they are replicable, and things that those components are things that we would see as being be beneficial to operate them at scale across other authorities. And I guess moving away from short-term, low-scale projects and programs, where obviously funding is an issue there, and often it's only sort of short-term funding that's available, but really trying to embed those key principles into mainstream service delivery. So you're really doing it at scale. There is obviously a place for shorter-term pilots and piloting of new approaches, absolutely, but I think from our perspective, where they exist, they should primarily be for the sort of purpose of generating evidence, and then, well, what can we learn about that we can take to scale? Just having a sort of short-term program that seems to show some impact, and then it's gone, and then moving on to another program the next year or the year after with these sort of gaps, and never really scaling what works within them is not going to be particularly impactful. I think another observation that we have with this is that risk of NEET is not just about the characteristics of the individual. Now, obviously, that is a part of the picture, but I think there's a whole range of things going on in local environments that aren't about the sort of characteristics of the young people, particularly around the sort of availability of EET provision and its alignment with the needs of young people. And we see there being benefit in bringing those wider risk factors into that picture and assessment of risk of NEET. So much harder to get data on that and bringing that data into a single place that allows you to do that analysis, but something we see as definitely as being beneficial. So yeah, definitely want to look at the sort of characteristics of the young person and how that changes over time and how that changes their vulnerability to becoming NEET. But there's also another part of the picture, which is the provision landscape into which they'll be moving, and trying to understand how changes in that will also increase risk of NEET, regardless of the characteristics of the individual. And then some of the emerging challenges that we see, and some of which Sarah's mentioned, and I'm sure are ones that others here would recognise. But the first one is that cohort that are vulnerable to NEET is growing. We've seen from some of the analysis we've presented here, but from other analysis we've done of cohorts of school leavers over the last 4 or 5 years, that proportion that have a vulnerability to NEET within those cohorts is getting bigger. So you've got more young people leaving school that are going to require support services, but the resources for those support services are unfortunately not growing. You've also got, of course, a growing number of people that are young people that are outside of school. So that's for a range of reasons. So we know elective home educating young people, that number has increased something like 3 or 4-fold over the last 5 or 6 years. I think it's approaching about 100,000 people, latest DFE statistics, 90 odd thousand people, young people that are electively home educating. We know also that a lot of those young people and families that make that decision are not fully aware of the sort of absence of support that exists for them once they leave school. So that's important, because if you're just targeting services to young people that are engaged in school, there's a growing group of people that we're going to be missing. So elective home education, but you've got people missing from education, and then you've got sort of young people as well with sort of inconsistent attendance at school as well. So at school focused provision, very important, but we mustn't forget there's a growing number of young people that are outside of school as well that are going to need support. And then I guess that point that I mentioned a moment ago, that is, once young people are into education, employment, training post 16, the importance of continuing that support for those that are most vulnerable, but then also keeping an eye on what that provision landscape looks like. One of the things that we've seen in the areas where we're working over the last few years is a reduction in some of those provision opportunities, particularly for young people who are sort of further from the labour market and perhaps most in need of support. And then the fifth observation we'd make, or the fifth point we'd want to make to share for discussion today, is we do think that greater sharing of learning across local authorities and service providers around what works, and using some sort of standardized metrics, assess successive approaches, would really improve learning and impact. We suspect there's plenty of people out there that have done similar kinds of analysis with their own cohorts and have lots of really excellent learning, but it doesn't seem to always be sort of shared we don't seem to be making the most of opportunities to share that. That includes us as well. So we think that the more opportunities like today to share what approaches have been taken and what evidence is emerging from those would be really useful. And then also not just sort of doing these sort of opportunistic studies as we've done here, but more sort of third-party evaluations as well, using sort of prospectively designed, rigorously prospectively designed studies would really help to grow our understanding and to improve the impact of services. And I would one of the very positive moves over the last 6 months was the YFF evidence toolkit, which is excellent, and I know there's plans to expand that further. But that's a really great repository of that evidence as it emerges. So more of that would be really helpful as well. I'm going to stop there. I can't see if there's any questions. I'm going to see if I can stop sharing my screen.
There's a few questions in the chat. I think one that would be interesting to pick up on is sorry, just checking. Deborah asked sort of just about the geography of Sefton. Obviously, myself included, might not necessarily know what kind of area Sefton's like, and sort of touching on, transport connectivity, and there's obviously a challenge with rural isolation and getting young people access to provision in those kind of areas. So Deborah was interested to know what kind of area Sefton is.
Yeah. So it's quite a long borough, geographical, very different from north to south. So we've got the coastal line on one side. So it goes right up the River Mersey up to Lancashire. And then the other side of the borough, we have got sort of farmland and does go to sort of 3 other boroughs as well. So very, and there's pockets of affluence, but real pockets of deprivation. I think the links within the borough aren't always great for transport, but then we do get where young people sometimes are educated outside the borough, or likewise where young people are educated in Sefton, but live outside the borough as well. And I think that's an added dimension when you're looking at local authorities or looking at school, because it's not necessarily your residents, as well, and that transition support and handover and partnership with the boroughs. So yeah, just in terms of that, that's the makeup. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Lucy, I noticed you've mentioned a sort of prevention program you're running. I can read out what you've said, but I don't know if you want to come in.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, because we do run a program pre-16, but just for years 10 and 11. I just wanted to know what your transition program looked like, and then also I was just making a point there that we've got additional priority groups. I know you've mentioned elective home education, but we're seeing increasing numbers in that as well. But we've got minimal alternative post-16 options. I'm just wondering what you have in your area, because we only really have our mainstream colleges, which young people in such as elective home education do struggle with. So yeah, it was just a bit about your transition program and how you support.
Yeah, so So in terms of the transition support, it's very much on an individual basis in terms of those employability engagements, lots of multi-agency meetings, you know, home visits, community, building that relationship, and then providing that IAG in the context of, you know, sort of that transition support and post-16. Because what we find is, with sort of poor attendance. So we work with our the pupil referral units, elected home educated, young people are our targets, our young people who are working with early help, and young people who are receiving complementary education, which we've seen a 50% increase in our year 11. So young people who are receiving CAM support, for example. Plus, we've seen a huge increase in non-engagement in education and attendance in Key Stage 4. So although we look to target our cohorts via the you know, the schools and our departments within the local authority, so you know, our SEND colleagues, our youth justice, our, you know, social workers and all those other teams, what we do is we get that data and we coordinate it from, you know, sort of really looking at how you know, we target those young people and those assessments. So it is you know, a lot of information and assessment that goes into supporting those, and then from that, it's, you know, there might be 2 or 3 lead agencies. So, you know, if it's school, if it's youth justice, ourselves, and it's about how we support, advocate and broker that support. In terms of provision, it's quite similar to FE colleges. Lots of our smaller provision and providers have gone, although we have just done, and it's took about 9 months, because of the data, being able to advocate and support with the LA some gaps in provision, and we've been able to get additional study programme. But again, it needs to be delivered by the FE colleges, because you know, they have to be a prime, you know, Ofsted inspections and things like that. So again, you know, that lack of, you know, sort of lack of choice, but lots of support with that, you know, those young people around those prep. We have seen an increase in our needs, but not on the scale of some of the other local authorities. You know, I think we've got about 30 young people who are NEET more than this time last year, but I know, sort of speaking, you know, and seeing some of the data, it's not on the scale as some of the other areas. What we do in Sefton is also have an extended duty, so we do track all our 18-year-olds. So what we are seeing is actually we've got a reduction in NEET at 18. So what we're seeing is, even now, some of our young people post-COVID are needing more time in that transition, and where the data that we've presented today is showing 2022. What we're seeing now is that you know, young people are needing even more time than the first 6 months of leaving, and actually it is around that place-based locality issues, as well as the young people, very much a holistic family approach as well. So we don't just deal with the young person, we look at what support the family needs as well to maximise those impacts. So yeah, you know, sort of, it can look very different for each young person that we're working with. Does that answer? Sorry.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thanks,
thank
Sarah.
you.
I'm just sort of working my way down what people have said in the chat. Laura, your question about what criteria do we use to identify risk of NEET is something we're going to pick up in the next section of the forum. So I'm not ignoring you. I'm just skipping over that one because we're going to ask it in the panel discussion. There's a question about your experience in terms of working with schools, and if schools have funded this piece of work. And, you know, I think that's an interesting point of how this goes down sort of with schools and what that relationship's like.
Yeah, so no schools that haven't funded it. It's the local authority commission. I think it was new in 2019 with schools. There's always been a sharing of information for September guarantee, and you know, that year 11 transition late, you know, sort of April, May time, this time of year for the year 11, but it was, you know, we've extended that duty further. I think we don't just work with the schools, we do work with the departments within the local authority. So it is about, as I said, you know, I think when we were remodeling, what we did was we looked at our current NEET at the time and what that characteristics were, and we found that obviously our vulnerable groups were key you know, in that. So working with the local authorities. So it's not just the schools identifying the at-risk of NEET, where actually sometimes we've got more information, or we've got more of a holistic view of that young person because of some of the external information that we'll have from the local authority. And as I said, in terms of particularly, we found a lot of our young people move around schools, or move into borough, or, you know, aren't attending school. So there's a lot of work that goes external. But in terms of how schools have received it, we engage with every secondary school in Sefton, which is about 18, and you know, they've all, I think, year on year, because of the impact and the partnership, have become more engaged as we've gone on with the contract and the support and delivery of the service. So yeah, you know, I think that, does that answer that question?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks,
Sorry,
Sarah.
yeah.
So just before we move on to our panel discussion, which is the next section of the meeting, if anyone wants to come in and ask a question or contribute some thoughts, I know, Deborah, you've been putting some thoughts in the chat, so feel free to put your hand up if you want to contribute, or if not, we will move on. Yes, Deborah.
I just wanted to add something that came up with a local children's partnership, and this is where lots of agencies and lots of authorities and lots of groups are all working separately, but they don't seem to be joining up. I put it in the chat, but we had a shocking statistic that came out this month from local children's partnership that one of the secondary schools, the year 9 cohort, we've got half of the entire year's cohort identifying as having caring responsibilities within the home, and that having a significant impact on their education, their attainment, you name it. And I work for a housing association, so we're also seeing the effects of poverty. And as an employment and training officer, I am being inundated by parents saying, can you get my child work? They don't want them to go to college. They're actually pushing them to go and earn money. The issue being, what do employers want and value? Not just, you know, they need this. So how have you seen the lack of funding, lack of support for care hitting young people or children? Or is that something you've not looked at or even asked the question? Because I think if you did, I think it would be a shock.
Yeah, no, young carers is one of our vulnerable groups that we support and target, and actually have really good relationships with the caring centre in Sefton. So we do identify and we do support. We have seen a growing increase, and poverty is a big one. And I think, you know, I think we're going to probably get into the discussion around characteristics and, you know, indicators. And I think that's why you need flexibility and you need inclusion. And I think there is some key, you know, flags, but also you need to have those, you know, sort of relationships and, you know, and partnerships within the localities and with, you know, with the families and young people as well, to be able to identify, for it to be real quality and to be able to target. So yeah, we have seen an increase, and also decisions. What we see is so apprenticeships, which is a great opportunity for young people, as we know, that's having an impact in terms of families from low income, how it affects like benefits, because it's classed as employment status. So you would lose child benefit and obviously sort of household income. So, you know, we find that some young people who want employment go onto an apprenticeships and very soon will make a decision to leave because family, you know, it's affecting the family income. Also, we've seen where caring responsibilities, families are making decision on young people caring for the children, well, so that the parents can go to work. So it's like who can earn the most, you know. So, you know, so when we're working with that, you know, their decision, you know, we're assessing that in terms of those barriers, so we can, you know, try and mitigate them or look at them in medium to long term. And, you know, that's what we're seeing. This isn't, you know, we've seen over the, you know, 3 or 4 years, well, we're in our 5th year of now delivering this service. We want to see sustained change. This isn't about, you know, sort of just moving young people into any pathway. This is about making a change and giving young people and families the tools to be able to, you know, to progress into the world of work. So yeah, we're seeing all those challenges, Deborah, that you've said, and it is something, it is a group that we want to include when we are assessing the needs as well.
Fantastic. Okay, in that case, I think it's probably time for us to move on to the next agenda item. So I'm just going to change around who's spotlighted. So we've obviously heard from Career Connect about what I think is a really great example of where this is being dealt with on the ground. I'm going to bring in Richard Dorman-Savage from the Careers and Enterprise Company now, and invite him to sort of give us a bit of an introduction about the work and the thinking that the Careers and Enterprise Company are doing in this area. You're on mute, Richard.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I have a few slides just to quickly run through to give you the overview of what we're about. I wasn't sure whether you all know a massive amount about the Careers and Enterprise Company, so here you get a little bit of the corporate introduction. Hopefully you can see the corporate slide now in front of you. Sarah, I can see you if you could just confirm that there's a CEC slide up. Great. So if you haven't come across CEC greatly before, then we're DfE funded and we're the national body for careers education. So without apology, we will recognise that we are very much focused on young people who are still in education. We are focused on the broad CEIAG, if we sort of go back into some of the old acronyms of careers education, information, advice and guidance, and that spectrum of activity that schools will be particularly active on. So we work with schools, primary schools and colleges. Primary is relatively small, but starts to sort of touch on some of the things that we are working on around NEET. Come on, slides. The very quick summary of how you might come across us most actively is through the careers hubs. So each area in England has a careers hub, 45 of them around the country, 4,700 schools involved in them. So fine, there are 5,050 schools in the country at the moment, so the coverage is now pretty close to full. One of our activities or our approaches is to link to employers. And we have a relatively large army of our enterprise advisors linking into the schools, and we have cornerstone groups. So this is Beacon Employer.
So I think we might just have lost Richard then. Hopefully he's going to come back.
I'm not sure what happened there, but my connection
Yeah.
seemed to disappear.
Yeah, we seem to lose you, but you're back now, so hopefully you can share your slides again and
Yep.
Fantastic.
Okay, so in terms of I've given you the overview of the network basically. So the direction that I want to take the conversation is CEC absolutely initially had no remit around NEET. So our focus was very much on careers education and establishing careers education more fully within the school system in the ashes of what connections was left in various parts around the country, and building up the schools' accountability for providing careers education. So we're now 6 years old. We've got to a point now where there is a confidence that initial mission has been, well, okay, largely achieved, we would say, or certainly the situation has improved. And therefore, we started to move things forward in terms of careers leaders have become really well established foci within schools. Careers hubs are strategic bodies that are supporting and encouraging the activities of schools and partners in the area, and CC takes this general strategic role. COVID really brought the issue of neatness to the fore. It's something that I have in my careers history, so I kind of led the company towards some of this stuff to try and do more active support at that stage. Process is relatively slow, but for the first time this coming year, we will have a prevention of NEET aspect added into our grant funding agreement with DfE. So what we are seeking to play is a coordinating role. We are not seeking to be an aggressive provider, a competitor to other organizations. We are an aggregator, a collector of practice, and a collation into what we feel is a strategy that is required around risk of neat and neatness. What we've also sort of obviously sort of had is links with local authorities, but those have actually grown significantly for us in the recent couple of years. As LEPs have started to fade from the picture, sorry, acronym, I hope everyone's happy with the local enterprise partnerships, but they are now being subsumed within local authorities and combined authorities, and with much more obvious intent. Perhaps the local enterprise partnerships had a very wide interest in the broad economic development of an area. Local authorities obviously carry a lot more accountabilities in terms of neat and risk of neat, and therefore they're very interested in responding to this agenda. So what we are in the process of developing, I'm not going to suggest that we are fully formed in this yet, and you won't be able to read this, but you'll get the slides so you can see it later. But what we're trying to develop is a proper approach to this at a national scale. We would say there is brilliant work being done in various places, but it is so spiky. Depending on which part of the question you ask, we can start with relatively simple things such as, does an area have a significant neat tracking resource? And we can get a very spiky profile around that, around some having a significant resource and some having very, very little. We can talk about risk of neat and do you understand the issue that's coming out at your institutions? Some areas are not running risk of neat at all. It's not a mandatory requirement from local from DfE. Some are running significant schemes around it, and then the interventions that come off the back of it. What evidence base are they working from, and how are they funded? Some of the points that were made by Gary in the previous conversation. So CEC is developing this theory of change around neat. There's no massive rocket science involved in here. We're trying to pull together the practice that's available and trying to represent it at a national scale. The very simple bit in the middle of the diagram, if you can see at least the 1, 2, 3 items on there, they relate to work out who needs to help, provide them with some help, and work out what works in terms of that help and what is effective. So that's what we're sort of working towards, is trying to put together this national strategy. Currently, we're running 6 projects around the country around risk of neat. Immediately regretting calling it risk of neat, because what our whole focus in here has been to work younger and to be far more schools led with a broader risk measurement. So risk of poor engagement, risk of disengagement, risk of poor transition. If only we could find an acronym that worked nicely with all of those. So the work that we have in those 6 areas listed down the bottom are trying to produce school-focused risk measures that provide the school with the ability to adjust their existing provision or to commission provision that meets the needs of their young people. The data that we're asking hubs to local authorities and hubs working together on these to use in this activity is seeking to be as broad as possible. So we have had long conversations with the DfE team producing the risk of neat indicator and their revised guidance, which I understand is due out in the next week or 2. And we're trying to create the bit of clear water between the local authority roughly around post-16 transition focus that the DfE risk of neat measure has, and a iteration of that measure that that we can use far younger. So those 6 areas doing various things around this, running this academic year. And what I can give you some very quick pictures of the early learning from it. Again, there's not massive amounts of rocket science in here, but there is some really interesting bits. So the interest in bringing this from school, it was a question that was asked earlier, and schools are really keen on this. It's not just the moral imperative, which you may have heard in terms of education speak and the reasons for doing things in education. That's obviously valid, but they absolutely see the relationship to achievement, to engagement for those who aren't in education at the moment, and for progression in terms of progression within their own institutions and the commitment that they feel towards progression beyond their institutions. The data opportunities, I've been quite surprised. I have a significant history in the area, but we have some really great examples of data that can be used in a very different way. Data isn't everything, but it is giving us a basis for a proper assessment of need. Social care data, health data, police data, troubled families data. Areas are starting to mobilize those sources and to produce a really vivid picture of the needs that a young person has. We're also finding significant ground in capturing the pastoral knowledge, and that's a general term that I kind of came up with to capture the you know, at the one end of the extreme, it's the sort of teacher who, when you go back in at the end in year 11, you say, oh, this young person's appearing on our risk of neatness, and they said, yeah, I could have told you that 5 years ago. Well, this is how we're trying to capture some of that nuance and the non-data learning that is available from the relationship that institutions have with students. All of that information then, what we're also picking up from the early learning is it is well worth us investing a significant amount of time and resource into mobilising the careers leaders around the topic and equipping them to take the discussion further. So there's not much point in us just providing a list of names that arrives on the school's mat and it says risk of NEET at the top of it and off they go, because they don't. So what we're trying to do is to provide the careers leaders with a real structure and integration into their normal working, the ability to take the argument into SLT within schools and to push that argument around the school has an accountability and it can commission against that. Integrating tools, what we're seeking to do is to build a risk measure that lives within something that we call Compass Plus, which is a free resource that every school gets and allows them to manage their systems. And then we start to move on towards, and I'm not going to apologize that in my list of 1, 2, 3, this is the tip of 1 in terms of working out who needs the support. We don't pretend to have started to look at the interventions and which are the best interventions. We are working with people like YFF and other organizations to try and use the resources that they're doing, and we have some experience from some funded projects that we're doing as well. I'm going to skip very quickly over this in terms of our next steps, but there's nothing greatly strange in that we are seeking to package this up and take it on further. I know that there was questions then that we're going to have in terms of the discussion, so I'll stop there. My details will be on the slides. We are very much in listening mode and we're trying to build relationships in an area that CEC traditionally hasn't had relationships. So very happy to hear from anyone else who has contributions or interests in talking to us about the topic.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. Just a note for everyone, I'll be sending the slides out to everyone who registered, so you'll be able to find contact details, etc. on there. So now for the last sort of half an hour, 35 minutes that we have left for the forum, we're going to do something a bit different from what we normally do in this and do a little bit of a panel discussion with Sarah and Richard. So I'm going to ask a few questions and then at the end, we'll give the opportunity for members of the audience to ask a few questions. So first and foremost, this came up earlier, of course. The first question is, in your view, what are the key indicators of risk of neatness and how early can they be identified? And I will go to you first, Sarah, and then Richard.
I think it's Deborah's put it in the chat. I don't think that really there's a challenge about identifying who's neat. And I think you could start in primary school. I think it changes. And I think Key Stage 4 is a key. Spike to doing that. And I think we've already mentioned, I think there's very individual characteristics, but it's not to forget that locality and place challenges as well, that can put people at risk of NEET, as well as their own social issues and personal issues as well. So I don't know whether that answers the question, but yeah, I think because we touched on it before.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'll just turn to Richard and get your take on that.
So in terms of age and stage, our view is that we are really starting to ramp things up in year 7. So our aim is to produce a tool that from year 7 onwards provides a dynamic picture of where a young person's situation is. That picture can change over time, and that's a great thing because you can monitor the change and you can sort of evidence the impact of what you're doing, partly against the risk of NEET or the risk of whatever outcome you're particularly working against. The factors, got a real attitude on this at the moment in terms of the factors are fine and we can sort of name the factors, but the problem is you'll name 5, I can name a 6th, somebody else can name a 7th. But what we're also missing in that is the issues behind the factors. So if attendance, probably everyone could agree that attendance may be a significant measure of risk, but fine, what's behind that attendance? Because it may be that the poor attendance actually creates some opportunity and actually reflects a strength factor in a young person's view of neatness. But what may also be uncovered in there is things like caring commitments, and that's the bigger issue than perhaps the attendance, and therefore trying to get an understanding of those. We're trying to build a hierarchy that just tries to establish, okay, these are the key measures, but what are the things behind the measures?
Great. Sarah, you've got your hand up. Do you want to add something just on that?
Yeah, just I totally agree with what Richard was saying, but in terms of also you need to consider, you know, the protective factors as well. So we're not saying that all looked after children are going to be neat, but what we're saying is it's a risk factor. And but you know, if they've got a state, you know, if they've got good attendance, their academic ability, you know, the way they, you know, they're on a good potential, if they're with a stable family and all those other things are in place, then they're not necessarily going to be neat. But so it's about that assessment of what are those risks and what is that protective factors, and exactly what Richard, you know, what's behind that. And I think so you can have indicators, you know, which are going to give you some basis, but you need to have that you know, that deeper knowledge and assessment as well. Yeah.
Great. Fantastic. So moving on to the next question, and I think probably you'll both be able to answer this from different perspectives. Perhaps Sarah more from your experiences in Sefton and Richard more from the national picture. But I was interested to know about how much employability support is available to young people in the run up to key transition points. I'm talking 16 and 18 here. And I know from ERSA's perspective, in our manifesto, we think that there needs to be more access to high quality employment support. So yeah, I'll go to you again first, Sarah, and then Richard.
Yeah, so I think lots of year 11, you know, for us, you know, we do most of our interventions are in year 11 for our general. So we were probably, our targeted would be year 9 and 10, but then in terms of year 11, you've got September Guarantee and you've got all. So September Guarantee is a statutory duty in terms of support with, you know, with schools and the local authorities around that offer of learning. So I think there's lots of transition and targeting, and yeah, it isn't just about data, but that helps. If we've got 3,000 young people, we want to know who isn't going to make a successful transition, or who is less likely to, who hasn't got an offer of learning, as well as those young people we've already identified. So putting in those, you know, those interventions there as earlier, you know, in year 11 as possible for some of the practical applications. So for us in year 10, we know where the, you know, what the pathway is. By year 11, it's about implementing those sort of plans and putting those support, and a lot of hand holding for us. What we do find is, you know, as get from Richard's point in terms of the schools, but it's, you know, it's a lot for the schools if those young people aren't attending school. So it's, you know, those ones that are external from school take a lot of time to engage and support. And then at year sort of 14, in terms of that transition of the older, is we are finding that young people who maybe have not been at risk of NEET and are still not making that transition into the world of work. So they might have been on the right pathway, but they still haven't, you know, maybe got the right employability to make that transition into the world of work at 18. So I think that, you know, there's a lot of work at the A-scene, and in terms of post-COVID, in terms of maturity, in terms of lost employability and enrichment during those COVID times, and we are seeing the impacts of that now, and sort of that engagement with employers is key. So for young people who are on level 3 pathways, we're still seeing that. So it's not to lose sight that they could be at risk of NISA A-scene as well. Yeah.
That's it. Thanks, Richard.
And Jack, you may remember we surveyed around this question. So just over the turn of the new year into this year, we put a survey around all the local authorities because we were very interested in what the capacity was out there. And I think the survey would sort of come back saying Sefton was the exception rather than the rule. So we had a really good response rate. It was over 100 local authorities that had replied. The general picture is that most will say that they are doing something in terms of support to pre-16. They will also make comments, particularly as they were turning the year, that was at risk and that they were expecting it to reduce over the coming period. But what we also then when we dig deeper into the responses, it's the depth of the provision that's available, in that there are certain groups, often possibly locations, that may get access to additional support to the norm, or the support that is available in the location. But more generally, the population doesn't get access to a great deal of pre-16 support. A little bit more 17 to 18, where you can start to pick up things like NCS, and you can pick up well, both versions of the NCS depending on your use of acronyms. But the pre-16, I think we were clear coming out of the survey that what support there is available tends to be very much targeted towards the traditional vulnerable groups.
Great, thank you. Some really good points there. So one last question from me, and then I can see some questions are already coming in on the chat. So I'm noting them, and we'll work our way through them once we've been through this one. So I was interested to know how effective the link up is between schools, local authorities, and employment support providers. Obviously, in Sefton, it seems like it's better than most places, as Richard just flagged. And how could it be improved, or from your experience, Sarah, what works well in Sefton, I suppose?
So I think obviously the support of the LA and the guidance, and I think the confidence to share information. So in terms of privacy notices, local sharing of information, I think any support sort of nationally, or guidance for local authorities and schools around that, because I think initially that it's that sharing of information on volume that people get nervous about, and I think you need to make sure that you've got robust systems in place. There's always loads of changes as well within schools, and so it's about making sure that there's consistency in terms of communication, and continuity in terms of that support. And it's twofold. It's both. We've got a shared goal, and it's a sort of a win-win situation. It's about, for me, and Gary highlighted, there was no additional investment in Sefton. This was a total reshape of a service and model, and actually it was about working smarter. We couldn't have worked any harder than what we were working. There was, it was about efficiencies. It was about actually how can we work in a better way, and yeah, so thankfully all the schools are on board. There's really good, strong partnerships within Sefton. And yeah, but that's not without its challenges, and having to work through them. But I think, sort of relationship and communication, and having the support of the, local authority and decision makers within the local authority, and, strategic leads driving that has been key. But yeah, and that's my experience.
Fantastic, thank you. Richard.
And I'd add a little bit to what Sarah says. I agree completely. I think there's probably, I'd focus on effective as one of the words in terms of the relationship, and I'd sort of introduce the sort of idea of culture as well. So the effectiveness would be I don't think there's probably many or any schools that have very little relationships around the topic with local authorities. Most local authorities will have some sort of a panel that considers young people who potentially could end up at risk of NEET, but probably are at risk of other things as well. So there'll be some sort of panel system that supports that side of things. But how deep does it go? How much beyond the crimson red risk does it go in terms of those who are deeply at risk versus those who have a more moderate risk? And how is that sort of considered within the grouping when a panel meets? Is it purely thinking, oh, we're only here to talk about the crimson red and nobody's really thinking about the rest? The local authority relationship is quite key. I sort of introduced my own background. I worked for a local authority about 7 years ago, and I worked for them for about 10 years. It's obviously changed a significant amount since then, and the sway that a local authority has on schools is significantly reduced. MATs, the academies and the trusts are a more important route now in a lot of cases. So building relationships with strategic leads within multi-academy trusts is perhaps more effective in some areas now than with the local authorities. The culture point that I was going to make was, I think what local authorities can really support and create is the culture of both collaboration, but how that collaboration is driven. So again, no local authority is going to say they don't build a culture of collaboration, but what do they concretely do to support that? And I don't know if anyone's here from Somerset, and I'd welcome if I've had the wool completely pulled over my eyes in Somerset, but I find in Somerset there's a real culture that's been built there that has come through a lot of data sharing facilities, a lot of structures for discussion and focus on individual needs. And through that culture, the local authority has created a real opportunity for schools to share information, to be honest about their sharing backwards and forwards, and to have systems and structures that allow them to do that. So local authority is not doing anything, it's facilitating a lot of things there.
Great, thank you very much. I will pick up on a couple of questions in the chat, but if anyone has anything they'd like to come in and ask, please stick your hand up, or also stick a message in the chat and I can read it out. So first of all, from Rachel, and this is for you, Richard, regarding the 6 pilots for those at risk of being NEET, what type of interventions were included in those pilots? So work experience, employability workshops, etc.
That's great. None. Because what we really focused on was the measurement. So this was part of us trying to be really careful about not overeating the elephant. We wanted to take it one slice at a time and to get really clear on the identification of need. So it was a real question for us, and it was a real issue in the way through our commissioning process. But no, we did not put any particular features into this. Some of you may have come across another 6 areas. We seem to have a relationship with 6. That's a bit worrying, isn't it? But we have another 6 areas that are working on something called ETF, Employment Transition Fund, which is a sort of a more relationship-based project that was sponsored by a business that put a significant amount of money into a 3-year project in those 6 areas. There, yes, the learning is that targeted mentoring, YFF, on one hand, have evidence that mentoring for young people doesn't work for NEET, but it's the style of mentoring that's important, and YFF are now working through to a commission at the moment for the big project that they've got coming up, which is very much focused around mentoring, but it's the type of mentoring that's being put in. So targeted, focused mentoring absolutely has been part of the ETF projects, and also work experience and the right kind of building experiences of the workplace over an iterative process and period for young people to kind of get both the vocabulary, the labour language, the relationships, the ability to interact with adults, all of those things developing over a period of time, because hey, spookily enough, 1 week in year 11 doesn't tend to produce all of those employability skills just from a work experience thing. So multiple iterative experiences has been the case in those areas.
And I think my personal opinion on the mentoring point is it's quite hard to measure the kind of skills that mentoring is giving to a young person, directly how they relate to whether or not that young person becomes neat. I think it's what you picked up on in terms of the soft skills, and learning from a mentor is a different kind of intervention compared to a sort of stricter employability session. Lucy has asked a question for you, Sarah, and that's about whether or not you use an assessment framework to support the transition.
So we do have an assessment framework. It's very based on it, initiated from the CAF, so the Common Assessment Framework, which I think there was 18 factors. We've now got done 9. So, and again, it is around that assessment of protective factors as well as those barriers and challenges. So it's based from that, the CAF model that we use.
Fantastic, thank you. So I don't see any hands up and there's no more questions in the chat. So I think that leaves me to say thank you very much to Gary, Sarah and Richard for speaking at this forum. I think it's been a really good addition. I've just got a couple of points I want to make from an ERSA perspective before we drop off. My colleague Henry is going to put links to both our manifesto, which looks at 2024 and beyond for employment support, and we've made sort of 5 recommendations of things we think would improve the situation, not just for young people but for the sector in general, and also our new membership brochure for 2024. So if you're sat on this call and you're not sure if you're an ERSA member or you're not an ERSA member, have a look through that, or even if you are an ERSA member, have a look through that, because it will tell you what benefits you get and what that offers. And as always, we're reachable on policy@ersa.org.uk if you want to have a conversation about basically anything. And the last thing is, for the next edition of the Youth Forum, we're looking to focus on mental health, and particularly embedded mental health support in employment programs for young people. So if there's anyone on this call that's working on a program or knows someone working on a program where you have embedded mental health support using counsellors or whatever else, please get in touch with me and let me know, because we'd love to have you involved in the next forum. But thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you at the end of next month.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks a lot.
Bye.